Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be finishing up our look at the original Gen 13 miniseries with Gen 13 number 5. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. So before we get into today's video, let's just go ahead and address the elephant in the room. I sound like absolute crap. I have been dealing with a pretty significant sinus thing for the last 5 days. And unfortunately, it has affected my voice to the point where this is what you're getting. Now, I can tell you this is an improvement because a few days ago I didn't even sound this good and I couldn't make it through a sentence without coughing and or sneezing. So I guess I should at least be appreciative that I've reached a point where I can record. Unfortunately, it does mean that you're going to have to deal with at least one episode of me sounding like this, though I am hopeful that by next week's episode, I'll be back to normal. First published in July of 1994, we see that this cover is actually rather stark by comparison to the previous issues, with just this pure white background that has the characters in the middle. Now, I do appreciate the fact that this draws your eyes directly in at the characters, but it does seem kind of lackluster, and I am finding myself slightly bothered by the cast shadows that the characters have. Now, am I appreciative of the fact that J. Scott Campbell made a point to add the cast shadows? Yes. Very oftentimes when a cover like this exists where the characters are on a nothing background, the artist who draws this a lot of times won't put a cast shadow in, which gives the character of an illusion of just floating in empty space, even if they are meant to be standing. However, I can't help but notice that these shadows don't make sense. The light source that's causing them is all over the place. You'll notice that Burnout, Fairchild, Lynch, and Rainmaker's shadows are all going towards the left-hand side of the page, whereas Grunge and Roxy's shadows are coming towards the bottom of the page, out towards us, the reader. But this would be an impossible light source. There should be a light source kind of like directly behind Grunge and Roxy, that's causing their shadows and slightly in front of the rest of the group. So I'm not certain exactly how these shadows are supposed to exist. And I realize, yes, that I am in fact overanalyzing this, but I just can't get over it. Like it's one of those things that's just bothering me in the back of my head. And I had to point it out to everybody. I apologize. Story: Brendan Choi, J. Scott Campbell, and Jim Lee. Pencils: J. Scott Campbell. Inks: Alex Garner. Letters: Ken Lopez. Colors: Wendy Fouts. Assistant Editor: Sarah Becker. Editor-in-Chief: Bill Kaplan. Color Separations and Production: Wildstorm Effects. Ink Assistant: Sandra Hope. Cover by J. Scott Campbell and Alex Garner. The story picks up exactly where we left off in the previous issue, where we see that the team has managed to escape by jumping through a trash chute and getting out of the Project Genesis facility. Unfortunately, the trash chute dumped them all into a dumpster, and now they're all just piled up on each other. Fairchild being on the top and crushing everyone underneath her. They do make note of the fact that she's incredibly heavy now, and I'm wondering at this point if that means that her new size has also increased her muscle density. And the reason I bring this up is that while she did get much taller than she used to be, her body's proportions have stayed relatively the same, which would lead me to believe that her enhanced super strength may be coming from super dense muscle fibers, which would account for her weighing significantly more than she once did. Now, of course, Grunge is perving out over the fact that Fairchild's butt is directly in his face, and he's kind of happy about this. Unfortunately for him, everyone else is not. Fairchild specifically is kind of disgusted by it, while everyone else is just kind of being crushed underneath them and is, essentially just screaming at them to get off of them, especially Sarah, who is pinned at the very bottom, who is just like, come on, guys, let's do this. Get off of me. I'm dying down here. The team then exits the dumpster and does their best to regroup. Roxy starts by smacking Grunge in the back of the head, telling him that she knows what he was thinking and he's gross. However, Burnout states that they have bigger problems right now, and Sarah believes that They should all be taking the fight back to Project Genesis and making an assault on the building. However, Fairchild quickly cuts her off, stating that this is a terrible idea and that Lynch made a point to give them the opportunity to escape and that they should take it, as while they do have a lot of new superpowers, they're not trained in how to use any of them, and their abilities as a team are not exactly fleshed out. As she continues to try and argue her point, she's suddenly interrupted as the team all turns around in shock to realize that they've already been cut off by none other than Threshold. This bodes very bad for the team, as Fairchild thinks to herself that not only is Threshold incredibly powerful, he's also far more trained than any of them, as he was captured by Ivana when he was very young, and that he and his sister were both brainwashed and put through a rigorous training system in how to use their powers and also how to fight. And he's going to be more than a match for all the 5 of these young teenagers, or young adults, I should say. The only 2 who are underage, I believe, at this point are Grunge and Roxy. Everyone else is 18 or older. But Fairchild's really not liking the way this looks, and Grunge happens to agree with her. Also, I noticed that there's a bit of a printing error on this page where we can see some yellowish streaks running up and down the page. It's specifically just this page, which makes me wonder if this is something that occurred in every single copy of this issue, or if some copies don't have this. I am wondering, if you have a copy of this book, does your page have this as well? I also noticed that this happens to be the one page in the book where Burnout's costume is colored a little bit wrong. You notice here it's mostly white, when in reality it's supposed to be a yellowish hue. And I don't know if that had to do with what we're seeing here with the ink smears that are going down the page. Possible, not sure, but I thought I'd bring it up. Surprisingly, though, Threshold did not come here immediately to attack all of them. His initial plan was to get the gang to join him and his sister so that they could not only fight back against Ivana and Io, but also to eventually take over the world, as Threshold believes that they may in fact be the next evolution of human beings. However, the gang has no interest in joining forces with him, and they all believe that Threshold is crazy. And Bobby, aka Burnout, decides to take matters into his own hands, believing that they're more than a match for him as he unleashes a powerful fire attack. Unfortunately, Bobby vastly overestimated his abilities and underestimated those of Threshold, as Threshold uses his telekinetic powers to create a shield that reverses his attack back at him, hitting Bobby square in the chest. Upon seeing his friend go down, Grunge grabs a nearby rock and turns his right arm into a mass of boulder and lunges through the air, trying to land a punch on Threshold as he did earlier. However, Threshold states that he's not going to underestimate Grunge again, and uses his powers to not only grab Grunge's arm, but also start destroying it, as we see the rock crack and little pebbles split off, as Grunge realizes that he's in a real world of trouble right now, and he does not know how to deal with it. Grunge then falls to the ground with his arm completely disintegrating. He begins to panic a bit. Threshold decides that he's going to continue his assault, but Caitlin, realizing that the situation is getting out of hand, goes for broke and leaps onto Threshold's back, putting him in a chokehold. She believes that she has the upper hand now that she's inside of his defenses, and she is quite strong, giving her considerable super strength. Unfortunately, what she didn't realize was that Threshold is a very accomplished martial artist and has been training for years in the arts of hand-to-hand combat, so he grabs her hair and quickly flips her off of his back, throwing her to the ground on the desert floor. Realizing that she messed up, Caitlin begins to scold herself in her mind, saying, "That was stupid, Caitlin, what were you thinking?" And at this point, Threshold reveals that not only is he telekinetic, but he's also telepathic, as he states, "Yes, Caitlin, that was stupid. You should have thought better." Caitlin then begins to panic, realizing that the Threshold is capable of reading her thoughts. Threshold then explains that he is not going to go down without a fight and that he plans on making sure that all of the team joins him by the end of the night. Meanwhile, on the rooftop of the facility, we see that Ivana is trying to load up the last of the Gen active subjects as she is preparing to make her escape on a helicopter. Unfortunately for her, she's cut off when a familiar voice grabs her attention from behind. The voice in question, of course, belongs to none other than John Lynch, who has made his way to the rooftop. He intends on stopping Ivana, and she seems almost surprised at first, but then does admit that if anyone was going to survive the ordeal down below, it was going to be Lynch. He raises his pistol and orders her to stop what she's doing and release the kids that she's trying to load into the chopper. But she counters his offer, stating, "Why don't you just come back to IO with me? We can square all this stuff up with Kraven and go back to the way things were. Because if you pull that trigger, you're going to be a traitor and Kraven will hunt you till the day you die." Lynch, however, has no interest in going along with this, as he believes that IO has gone too far this time, and he orders Ivana to release the kids. However, Ivana states that Kraven has his own directive on this and that she's just going along with it, and the only way that the kids are going to get released is if she's dead. Lynch seems happy to oblige as he immediately pulls the trigger. However, Ivana blocks it with her hand and seems rather angry at the fact that Lynch fully intended to kill her. Lynch falls to the ground as the bullet impacted his eye. However, it was his cybernetic eyes which deflected the bullet once again and saved him from dying. But he's not certain how Ivana was able to pull this off until he turns around and sees that she too has gained quite a few cybernetic enhancements. And she states that this was necessary given what she was up against, and she needed something to even the odds between her and these superpowered beings. She then extends some razor whips from her fingers and attacks Lynch, stating that she's going to make sure that he can't stop her this time, and that she fully intends to make sure that this is the last time the two of them ever meet. Ivana then unleashes her razor whips once again, grabbing Lynch around the ankle and knocking him off of his feet. She then cackles, stating the years of being a middle-aged desk jockey have made him slow and predictable, and what would the other agents of Team 7 think if they could see him now, and if most of them weren't dead? But Lynch brings up the fact that Ivana is crazy and that she's under-talented and is just an evil witch who is trying to exploit her position for her own personal gains. And while most of this is true, Ivana takes real offense to it as she starts to drag Lynch in closer and unleash another set of blades from her other arm, stating that she fully intends to end Lynch's life. Meanwhile, back on the desert floor, Threshold continues to gloat, stating that while he may in fact not be able to convince them to join him, he can use his powers to force them to do so. Grunge and Fairchild state that he's outnumbered, but this only makes Threshold laugh as he states, "Your other two friends are too scared to even join into this fight," which, in the case of Roxy, is true. She's petrified with fear and believes that Threshold is going to kill all of them. But Sarah tries to comfort her and calm her down, and even brings up the fact that she's an Apache and she comes from a long line of warriors and that she's not going to give up without a fight. She then tells Roxy that the two of them do have their own powers, and as long as they're still breathing, they still have a chance of working together and bringing Threshold down. Threshold then tells Fairchild that he is actually a little bit impressed by the fact that several of them tried to fight him off, which is why he's going to give them one last opportunity to join of their own free will. However, Caitlin tells him that he's crazy and calls him Ivana's pawn, and states that she'd rather die than join forces with him. Grunge agrees, but then adds in, except for that whole dying part. Threshold, however, tells them both, though, that he has no intention of killing them as that would be too easy, and that if they won't join him willingly, he'll simply bring them to their knees and use his powers to force them to his side. The two of them do their best to try and fight off his mental attack, however, neither one of them are prepared to do so. Threshold then tells them that the only reason that he was working with Ivana in the first place was because she was gathering all of the Gen active children, which meant that she was basically building his army for him, and that as long as she remained useful, he was going to stay by her side. Meanwhile, in a little bit part of the desert, very close by, we see that Bobby is still kind of smoking and trying to regain his consciousness after being hit by his own attack. And he's been found by none other than Threshold's sister, Bliss, who is very much super horned up as is usual, and decides that she's taken a shine to Bobby. She then gets on top of him in her stripper-like outfit and tries to get him to wake up, telling him how handsome he is and how this is the way she likes her men underneath her. We're not really certain if her attitude towards sexual promiscuity is part of just her normal personality, or if this may be a result of the brainwashing that she suffered at the hands of Ivana, or if perhaps it's a side effect from her powers, which we've never actually seen her use up until this point, but we will in just a moment. As Bobby begins to wake up, Bliss states that this is the time that she's been waiting for, as she tells him to taste the power of Bliss, as she grabs him and kisses him passionately, releasing energy into his body. She then releases him, and as he falls to the ground, he's like, "Wait a minute, I remember you, you're..." And then she cuts him off and states, "I'm your Princess Charming, so how about you just lie back and relax and let me do all the work, big boy?" Which insinuates that Bliss never came here to try and help out Threshold. She came here simply to just try and get laid, which seems kind of crazy. However, in all of this, she doesn't notice that the two of them are not alone, and Rainmaker sneaks up behind her, grabs her, and unleashes an electrical charge, which knocks her to the ground. Burnout is a little bit worried as he states, "What did you do to her?" Rainmaker explains that she has the ability to release electrical charges into people and that it was mild and that Bliss will be okay. However, she then jumps on top of Bliss and states, "You're our ace in the hole now. You're going to help us stop your brother from killing our friends." Bliss states that Matthew does whatever he wants and that she's not going to be able to stop him. However, Sarah interjects, stating, "Wrong answer," as she grabs her arm and pulls it up behind her back. Bliss then screams and says, "Please stop, you're hurting me." This makes Roxy rather upset as she states, "Sarah, you're not really going to hurt her, are you?" However, Sarah states that this is not some kiddie game and that they're playing for keeps this time, and she's going to do what it takes to make sure they survive this ordeal. Meanwhile, back on the rooftop, Ivana tries to stab Lynch, who quickly moves out of the way, avoiding her attack. However, as she raises her arm up in the air once again in an attempt to end his life, Lynch realizes that he's out of options and that if he wants to survive this, he's going to have to go for broke, as he finally decides to use his powers and to hell with the consequences. He then uses his powers to wrap all of Ivana's whip-like tentacles coming out of her fingers around her body, tying her up tight like a pig in a blanket. He then tells Ivana that she should be happy that he was able to remain in control of his powers and asks her if she remembers what happened with Team 7. Ivana says that she does, but she also remembers that once Lynch uses his powers, he's left so weak that he can barely move. She then orders the men with her to load her onto the chopper so they can escape, as the building itself is about to explode, and Lynch is left on the building waiting for the self-destruct sequence to end. As he watches the helicopter fly away, he is thankful for the fact that he is still alive at this moment, despite the fact that there's only about 30 seconds left before the building blows. And he quickly uses a communicator on his wristwatch to radio for help that he hopes will get there in the nick of time to save him. Also, if you'd like to know more about what Lynch is referencing with Team 7, you can check out all my videos about Team 7 in my Team 7 playlist. The rooftop of the facility then explodes in a giant fireball, and Ivana in her helicopter starts to laugh and exclaim that victory is hers and that John Lynch is finally dead. She then revels in the fact that they were able to get away with the last of the remaining Gen active specimens, and that with her own Gen 13 operatives, she'll finally be able to get rid of Miles Craven and take control of Io for herself. The explosion also grabs the attention of Threshold, who looks up and sees that Ivana is escaping, not only abandoning the Genesis project, but him as well. He then states that it wasn't supposed to end this way and wonders why she would betray him given that victory was within their grasp. However, his attention is grabbed when Fairchild tells him that she's abandoned him like rats abandoning a sinking ship, and that the whole thing is over and that he needs to give up. However, this enrages Threshold even more as he turns around and snaps at Fairchild and Grunge, stating that the only thing that's over is their lives. The two of them are rather terrified at this point as they realize that they're unable to stand up to Threshold and that this may in fact be the end for the two of them. However, before Threshold can unleash an attack, he is distracted by a hailstorm of bullets coming at him from behind. We then get an advertisement which is showing Willis Portacio's summer appearance schedule. Willis Portacio, of course, being the creator of Wetworks. If you'd like to know more about Wetworks, you can check out my Wetworks playlist. We then see that the bullets came from the small contingent of Black Hammers who are accompanying John Lynch. They saved him from the rooftop of the building before it exploded, and now he and they plan on saving all of the kids before Threshold kills them. Lynch tells Threshold that the whole thing is over and that he needs to give himself up, and Threshold tries to remain defiant, stating, "I have no plan of surrendering to you. You have no idea how powerful I am." However, Lynch rebuttals by stating that, "I know exactly how powerful you are. You and I are the same. And I think that it's time that you give it up, son, and just go home." However, Threshold tries to remain defiant, stating, "I'm not your son. It was men like you who killed my father. And why is it that you think I won't just destroy all of you before I leave?" However, it's at this exact moment that Rainmaker and the rest of the gang show up with Bliss in their possession, as Sarah says, "Well, we've got her, so maybe you want to consider that before you continue this fight." Lynch then interjects and tells Threshold that these kids are not his enemy and that it was Ivana and Craven who were responsible for his parents' death. Sarah then reminds him that Bliss would be rather useless in a fight. And at this point, Threshold seems to realize that he's lost the upper hand, as he grabs his sister and throws her over his shoulder. She tries to protest, but he simply responds by stating, "Shut up, Nicole." He then tells them that while they may have won today, that he'll definitely be back eventually, and that they're not going to like it when he shows up and finds them on their next confrontation. He then flies away, and Caitlin looks up and asks Mr. Lynch if he believes that Threshold really will return. Lynch responds by stating, "Well, I would if I was him." The rest of the gang looks up and believes that their ordeal is finally over. However, we notice that Burnout states, "Man, she sure is beautiful." And this catches Sarah off guard as she simply states, "Huh?" And this would imply that Bliss's powers are still affecting him and making him desire her with forces that he can't control. At this point, though, one of the Black Hammer suits approaches Lynch as it starts to open up and tells him to stand clear. And when it does so, we see that it's none other than Hawkins who is piloting the suit along with another soldier. And this is kind of cool. I like the idea that they took one of these suits and showed that it actually requires two people to pilot it, and making it out to be more of a bipedal exo tank than just an armor. Lynch actually takes this moment to thank Hawkins for helping him out of a tough spot, especially saving his life up on the rooftop. Hawkins responds by stating it's all in a day's work, and then asks if it's time for them to go back to IO headquarters, as she states they're probably going to be mad if they notice that they borrowed this experimental Black Hammer armor. Lynch tells Hawkins, though, that we'll just consider this use of the armor a very highly classified field test. The man in the suit with Hawkins then tells them that he's receiving an IO transmission, and Hawkins tells Lynch that they need to get going if they're going to get back to IO headquarters without being discovered. Lynch, however, tells her that he's not going to be joining her, as he believes that this is kind of the end of the road for him in IO, as there's no way he'd be able to explain this little fiasco. And Hawkins realizes that he's right and actually thanks Lynch for everything that he's done and tells him that it's been an honor to serve with him. Lynch shakes her hand and tells Hawkins that the honor was all his and that he'll never forget her and the rest of the boys. As he turns around to Caitlin, she asks him, "Did you just quit your job?" And Lynch states, "Yeah, IO's not exactly the type of organization that accepts a resignation letter, and unfortunately your father found that out the hard way." He then tells her that he plans on trying to stick with the kids and help them out. As Caitlin is rather surprised by this, she says, "Thanks, I think." We then see that Sarah is still rather worried about Bobby as she states, "You look really woozy." And Bobby responds by stating, "I don't know what Bliss did to me, but my head is buzzing." Roxy then grabs onto Grunge, elated that his arm has completely reformed. And even Grunge seems a little surprised, stating, "Yeah, there's not even a scratch on it. I think I could actually get used to this whole superpower stuff." Caitlin then thanks Lynch once again, stating, "You went out on a limb to help us, and I'm not sure where we go from here." Lynch tells her that they're more than welcome to join him, as all of the Gen 13 kids are really special and have quite a bit of incredible abilities that he believes could be used to change the world for the better, and that he's more than willing to help teach them how to use their powers if they're willing to come with him, lay low, and wait for all of the hubbub to die down around the destruction of this Project Genesis facility. All of the kids seem more than willing to go with him, as they don't seem to have a whole lot of other options. And at the very end, we see Grunge hanging out from behind a folded panel, stating that this is just the beginning of the new series and that very soon issue number 0 will be coming out to bridge that gap. Which brings up a very important point. I, unaware of exactly how the numbering worked for these books, mistakenly recorded my episode on issue number 0 before recording all of my episodes for the miniseries. So, if you're watching this and you have not watched my episode on Gen 13 number 0, now would be the time to do it, as it happens chronologically after issues 1 through 5 and before issue 6. My bad. I should have looked into it more before I recorded my episode on Gen 13 number 0. We then get to the letter column where people submit their letters, which can often involve questions or criticisms, and sometimes their own fan art, which occasionally gets printed, as we see right here. Most of the letters are pretty straightforward, just praising all of the team for all of the great work they did, but there was one in particular that I found to be somewhat critical, and I was kind of surprised at the way the team dealt with responding to it. The letter criticized quite a few things that I've seen other people criticize about Gen 13, namely the over-sexualization of the female characters in the series. Notably, he brings up that it looks as if they just drew water balloons under Fairchild's costume, and also bringing up the point that all of them are teenagers, some of them only high school aged, and it seems rather inappropriate to sexualize younger characters like this. And these are actually very valid criticisms that I feel like the team could have addressed. However, instead, they just went with a joke response stating, "Sharp eyes, those actually are water balloons under Fairchild's costume," which seems like a real cop-out. Like, if that was the way you were going to respond, why even bother printing up this letter in the first place? We see a couple more pieces of fan art, and on the next page, we get, once again, a preview of the Wildcats animated series that we've seen in other issues of other Wildstorm books from this era. I'm not going to get too deep into this, namely because I've talked about it in other episodes, though I still find it odd that they very much changed Voodoo's costume to make it far less revealing, but did very little to do the same to Zealot's costume, which is just as revealing as it was in the comic books. We then get some storyboarding on the next page with a few animation sequences mapped out for what they were going to be doing in this particular episode. That's all kind of cool. We then, of course, get 2 pages that are showing the designs for both Hellspawn's Behemoth and the Demonite Hovership. I still really like this design for the Behemoth. This is a super cool, alien spacecraft design, and it is 90s as all hell, but I I gotta say, I really do like this. This is something I enjoyed a lot when I first saw it, and I still enjoy it to this day. On the final page of the book, we get a rundown of the creative team behind the animated series. Once again, I've already spoken about all of this, so I'm not going to get into it here. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the Lord of the Rings Super Nintendo game. I'm pretty sure this has come up in past episodes too, but if it hasn't, it's not a great game, folks. I've played it before. The controls are kind of terrible. The game is cryptic as all hell as to what you're supposed to be doing. And it's one of those things where they tried to make a video game based on a trilogy of novels, and it was really ambitious for the time and not executed well. If you want to experience it for yourself, you can probably find an emulation of it somewhere on the internet. Personally, I don't recommend it. It seems like kind of a waste of time. I'm sure there's some people out there who really love this game, but I'm damn sure not one of them. And that was Gen 13 number 5. Overall, I felt like it was a pretty good conclusion to the mini-series. It really does a good job of setting up for the ongoing series and leaving enough of an opening between what happened with Lynch and Ivana and also Threshold and Bliss and the rest of the team here to give us a very clear-cut hero-villain dynamic. My only real complaint about the series as a whole is just that we didn't get more about Threshold and Bliss's characters explained to us, especially given that issue number 1 opens up with their parents being killed and them being abducted by IO. I feel like there's a lot that can be done with Matthew and Nicole's characters, and that there's a lot of depth that can go into explaining more of how their villain arc happened and really getting into the whole brainwashing aspect of them being raised from young children into adults in the IO facility and being forced to do the bidding of Craven and train under his watchful eye to be used as weapons their entire lives. It seems like an interesting story point that, while not being able to be fully explored throughout the entirety of this miniseries, I feel like it should have been given more attention than it was. The only other criticism I have is Pitt being in this series. As much as I like Pitt, him being in this was completely unnecessary, other than to just give power scaling to Fairchild, which I feel like you could have done with or without him. But then again, sell them books any way you can, and if you've got to grab another really popular character from the Image universe to do so, so be it, I guess. But then again, these are just my opinions. Your opinions may be that this entire series was terrible and that you hated the way it ended and that you thought the setup for the ongoing was awful. Or you might really believe that everything about it was perfect and that you enjoyed Pitt being in it and you don't care about the characters of Threshold or Bliss being explained any more than they were. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.